The rain had stopped just before the guests began to arrive. The driveway leading up to the mansion glistened under the soft glow of golden lights that lined the garden path. The tall windows of the grand house sparkled, reflecting the flicker of candles from inside. The place looked like a dream, warm, rich, and full of life. Inside, laughter flowed easily at first. Waiters in black suits carried trays of crystal glasses filled with wine, and the air smelled faintly of roasted almonds and perfume. Music played softly from hidden speakers. People talked in low, polished voices, some pretending to be more important than they really were. It was the kind of gathering where everyone smiled too much, but no one felt truly comfortable. At the center of the main hall stood a piano. It was not just any piano. It was massive, shining black, with carved legs and golden trim. It looked like something that belonged in a royal palace. A long chandelier hung right above it, scattering light across its surface like small diamonds. People admired it, whispered about it, and walked around it, but no one dared to touch it. The host of the evening, a man known for his enormous wealth and quick temper, stood near the piano. His reputation was well known in the city. Some called him generous. Others said he enjoyed making people feel small. He had built his fortune through clever deals, but along the way, he had also built a habit of testing others, pushing people to see how far they would go to impress him. He looked around the room, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "But something's missing." The guests turned toward him. He walked over to the piano, placing his hand lightly on the lid. "This," he said, tapping it with a finger, "hasn't been played in years. It's a shame to let it sit here silent." A few people murmured in agreement, though no one moved. The man smiled a small, knowing smile. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll pay $1,000 cash to anyone in this room who dares to play even one note on this piano." The room went silent. The music from the speakers was turned off, as if the house itself wanted to listen. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. But the host wasn't joking. His tone had that teasing sharpness everyone recognized. A tone that meant he was serious, but he wanted to make you feel small for taking him up on it. He looked at the faces around him, amused. "What? No volunteers?" he asked, pretending to sound surprised. "Surely one of you has the courage to play a single note? Just one key. That's all." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to step forward. Everyone had heard strange rumors about that piano. How it used to belong to a famous composer who died suddenly while playing it. How his unfinished piece remained trapped in its strings. How once, late at night, the piano had played on its own. Of course, those were just stories. But standing there in that glittering hall, the instrument seemed to hold some kind of quiet power. Its polished surface reflected the faces of those staring at it, as if it were watching them back. The host chuckled softly. "Perhaps you're all afraid of music now?" he said, swirling the drink in his glass. "Or maybe you're afraid of losing your dignity over a simple challenge." A few guests forced a laugh, trying to hide their discomfort. Others looked away, pretending to be suddenly very interested in their food or phones. One woman whispered to her friend, "He's doing it again, trying to humiliate someone." But no one stopped him. He began to pace slowly, enjoying the attention. "It's funny," he said, raising his voice slightly. "You all sit here, dressed in your best, talking about confidence and success. Yet not one of you can walk a few steps and press a key. Just one note." The words hung in the air like smoke. The piano gleamed under the chandelier, silent and waiting. A young man near the buffet table whispered, "Why would he even offer money for something like that?" "Because he knows no one will do it," someone replied quietly. "He likes watching people hesitate." The host lifted his glass toward the piano. "You see, my friends, life is full of these moments," he said. "Everyone wants reward, but no one wants risk. Everyone wants to win, but few want to act." His tone carried both arrogance and something else. A hint of loneliness, perhaps, though no one could tell. He enjoyed being in control. He enjoyed knowing that he could move a room of people with a few words. One guest cleared his throat and asked, "Is there a reason no one should play it? I mean, it's just a piano, isn't it?" The host's eyes glimmered. "Of course, it's just a piano," he said smoothly. "But people have their superstitions. I can't help it if a few ghost stories scare them." Laughter rippled through the room, uneasy and thin. Someone asked, "So, if someone plays a note, you'll really pay them $1,000? On the spot?" The host replied, his smirk widening. "Cash. But I doubt anyone will try." He leaned against the piano now, his reflection glinting off the glossy surface. The chandelier's light danced across his watch, throwing sparks of gold around the room. For several moments, no one moved. The silence grew heavy. The piano, though untouched, seemed almost alive, waiting for someone to break the tension. A waiter passed by, trying not to look at it. Even the air felt different now, as if everyone had stepped into some strange, invisible circle of fear. In the corner, a group of older guests whispered among themselves. One said he'd heard the piano was imported from Europe a century ago, made by a craftsman who poured his soul into its design. Another said the last person who played it claimed to hear a second note echoing back, a note no one else heard. The stories became wilder with each whisper, feeding the quiet unease in the room. The host seemed pleased. "Ah, the imagination of people," he said, pretending to sigh. "So many tales, so much fear." He took a slow sip of his drink, eyes never leaving the piano. "But that's what makes life entertaining, doesn't it?" His voice echoed slightly, the way it sometimes does in a big empty room. A few people tried to lighten the mood. Someone joked about bringing a child to play the note since adults were too afraid. Another said maybe the piano was broken anyway, but their laughter didn't reach their eyes. The host suddenly set his glass down with a soft clink and said, "Tell you what, I'll double the amount. $2,000 for a single note." That made people stir. 2,000 was a lot of money, enough to make anyone think twice. But still, no one moved. The man's smirk faded into something sharper. He looked at the crowd as though measuring them. "You see? This is what comfort does. It makes people cowards." A faint clap of thunder rolled outside, far away but just close enough to deepen the silence. The chandelier trembled slightly, and one of its crystals chimed faintly like a tiny bell. The host smiled again as if he had planned even that. "Well," he said, "perhaps the piano will stay silent a little longer." He turned away, waving to the band to start playing again. But the musicians looked uneasy too. None of them wanted to sit near the piano. The night continued, but the energy had changed. The guests talked, laughed, and ate. But every few minutes, someone's eyes drifted toward the piano again. Its black surface caught every flicker of light, every passing shadow. Even as the clock struck midnight, it stood there like a secret waiting to be told. The host had forgotten about his challenge by then, lost in conversation and wine. But not everyone had. In one corner, near the back of the hall, someone was still watching. Quietly, thoughtfully. A person who didn't seem like much to the others. Dressed simply, unnoticed among the crowd, but whose eyes held a different kind of curiosity. They didn't believe in ghost stories. They believed in courage. And as the music played and the laughter grew louder, that person's gaze stayed fixed on the piano, as if already hearing the sound of that single note that no one else dared to play. The night grew older, but the unease from the millionaire's strange challenge still hung in the air. Music filled the hall again, yet it didn't feel the same. People tried to laugh, tried to look relaxed, but there was something heavy between them now. An invisible thread of tension that pulled everyone's thoughts back to the piano standing silently in the center of the room. The piano looked almost alive under the chandelier's glow. Its polished black surface reflected the lights like a dark mirror, and sometimes, when someone walked past it, they could almost swear they saw movement in its reflection, like a flicker of something that wasn't really there. The host had moved on to chatting with a few close guests near the fireplace, his laughter booming across the room. He seemed satisfied with how his little game had unsettled everyone. To him, it was all part of the fun, watching people squirm between curiosity and fear. But to the rest of the guests, It felt like there was something deeper behind his smirk. Something they couldn't quite understand. Groups formed quietly around the hall. People spoke in low voices, careful not to draw the host's attention. One woman leaned close to her friend and whispered, "I heard that piano used to belong to a famous composer. They say he collapsed while playing it during a concert." Her friend frowned. "Collapsed? You mean?" "They say he never finished the piece he was playing. Some say the piano keeps the last note trapped inside. Every time someone tries to play it again, it won't sound right, like it's missing something." Another guest, overhearing them, joined in. "That's not how I heard it," he said. "I heard it came from an old European theater that burned down years ago. It was the only thing that survived the fire. Some people say it still smells like smoke when you open the lid." The women looked at each other uneasily, glancing at the piano. The hall buzzed softly with murmurs as the stories spread from one corner to another. Each person added a new detail, and soon, the piano had become a thing of mystery and fear. A man near the dessert table shook his head. "It's all nonsense," he said, trying to sound brave. "It's just an instrument." But even as he said it, his eyes flickered toward the piano, and he quickly looked away again. The host, watching from across the room, smiled to himself. He enjoyed this, the way a few careless words could change the mood of an entire night. It reminded him of how easily people could be controlled, not with force, but with suggestion. The piano stood there like a quiet test of courage. It seemed to listen, patient and proud, as people whispered their fears about it. Meanwhile, the man who had been watching from the corner during the challenge earlier was still there, calm and thoughtful. He had seen the way everyone reacted, the fear, the pride, the hesitation. Something about it bothered him. It wasn't about the piano or even the money. It was about how quickly people gave in to the opinions of others. He watched as a young woman approached the piano slowly, holding a glass of wine. She looked around to see if anyone was watching her. When she thought no one was paying attention, she reached out as if to touch one of the keys. But just before her fingers met the smooth ivory, someone called her name from across the room, and she pulled back quickly, laughing it off. Her laughter was nervous, forced. "It's silly," she said to the person who had called her. "I was just curious." But the truth was, she had felt something. Something about the silence of the piano that drew her in and frightened her at the same time. The man in the corner noticed that moment. It stayed with him. As the night went on, the whispers turned into stories, and the stories became wilder. Someone claimed the piano had been tuned by a man who disappeared a week later. Someone else said it played a note by itself during storms. And though no one had proof, no one dared to laugh too loudly either. It was strange how easily people believed in fear when they were told not to be afraid. The host eventually stood up again, his glass raised high. "You all look far too serious," he said with a chuckle. "It was only a game, my friends. Just a little fun." But his tone still carried that teasing edge that made people uncomfortable. He walked toward the piano once more, and this time, he ran his hand along its side slowly, as if testing it. The room grew quiet again, every eye watching him. He looked around, smirked, and said, "I don't believe in ghosts, but it seems the rest of you do." A few people laughed awkwardly. The man paused, then said louder, "Do you know what fear really is? It's nothing more than imagination left to rot. It's when you let your thoughts control you instead of the other way around." He tapped the piano lightly, producing no sound. "But I must admit," he continued, "this piano does have history." That caught everyone's attention. He smiled when he saw their curiosity. It once belonged to a musician who valued his art more than life itself. He played here in this very room decades ago. Some say the last piece he played was so beautiful that he refused to stop, even when his hands began to tremble. The crowd leaned closer, silent. "He died sitting right here," the host finished softly, placing his hand on the piano seat. "And from that day, no one in this house has played a single note." He stood up again, his face expressionless. "Until someone does, perhaps the silence will stay." The story froze the room. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then people began to murmur again, unsure whether to believe him or not. Some said he was just trying to entertain the crowd. Others felt a chill that no laughter could erase. The band stopped playing soon after. The soft hum of conversation filled the silence again, but it wasn't cheerful anymore. It felt like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Outside, the wind began to rise. The curtains near the windows shifted, and the chandelier swayed gently, scattering light across the piano's black surface. The man in the corner noticed that even the host didn't touch the piano's keys. For all his pride and wealth, he too avoided pressing a note. That thought stayed in the man's mind. He stepped away from the crowd, walking slowly toward the back of the hall where a row of framed paintings hung. They were portraits of people who had once owned the mansion, men and women dressed in fine clothes, their painted eyes following him as he passed. He stopped in front of one painting that showed a man seated beside the same piano, his fingers resting on the keys. The artist had painted his expression carefully, half peace, half sadness. The man stared at the painting for a while, wondering what kind of life that musician must have lived. Was the story true? Did he really die here mid-song? Or was it just another tale to make the piano seem more valuable? He turned back toward the hall. The piano still stood in the same place, proud and still. The people around it looked smaller now, their laughter emptier. He couldn't understand why something so simple, a musical instrument, had such power over everyone. Was it really fear? Or was it pride? He thought of how easily people allowed others to define their limits. The host had challenged them and no one had moved. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to be the one everyone laughed at if something went wrong. Fear of judgment, he thought, was stronger than fear of any ghost. As the night thinned and some guests began to leave, the piano remained untouched. Its surface was scattered with faint reflections from the last of the candles. The man in the corner stayed a little longer, listening to the fading chatter and the soft patter of rain returning outside. Before stepping out, he turned once more toward the piano. The host was standing nearby, smiling politely as he said goodbye to guests. But even he didn't look at it directly. The man whispered under his breath, "It's just a note, just sound." And yet, deep down, he knew that for everyone in that room, that piano had become something more than wood and strings. It had become a mirror, showing them not what they saw, but what they feared. He walked out into the cold night, the sound of the wind following him down the steps. Behind him, the mansion's tall windows glowed faintly, and for a brief second, it almost seemed like the chandelier flickered. Not from the wind, but from something inside. And though the piano had not made a sound that night, its silence was louder than any music that could have filled the room. The storm outside had grown stronger by the time the clock in the hallway struck 1. The guests who remained were fewer now, but the tension inside the mansion was still the same. The sound of wind pressed against the tall windows, and each gust made the chandelier sway slightly, its crystals clinking together like tiny bells. The piano still stood untouched in the center of the room. Its polished surface caught the dim light, reflecting every flicker of the fireplace. It looked beautiful and mysterious at the same time, like something waiting to be discovered, or perhaps something that wanted to be left alone. The host sat back in his chair near the fire, a half-finished drink in his hand. His earlier energy had faded into a kind of quiet amusement. He liked how his challenge had turned into a story of its own, spreading through every corner of the room. It made him feel powerful, as if he could control not just people's attention, but their fears. Across the room, small groups of guests continued to whisper. No one mentioned the challenge directly anymore, but every few minutes, their eyes would drift toward the piano again. No one wanted to be the one who broke the silence. That was when a soft voice from the back of the hall spoke. "I'll do it." The words were quiet but clear. They cut through the low murmur of voices like a spark in the dark. Heads turned quickly toward the sound. A man stepped forward from near the back wall. He wasn't dressed like the others. His suit was plain, slightly worn at the edges. He didn't wear a watch that cost more than a car, and he didn't walk with the air of someone used to being noticed. But the way he stood calm, steady, drew everyone's attention. The host looked up, amused. "You'll do what exactly?" he asked, pretending not to know. The man met his gaze and said quietly, "Play a note on your piano." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Some of the guests exchanged glances. Others tried to hide their smiles. No one expected anyone to actually accept the challenge, especially not this man. The host leaned back, smiling lazily. "You?" he asked, as though testing the word. "You're willing to press a key when no one else would?" The man nodded once. "Do you play?" the host asked. "Not really," the man said. "But I don't think that matters. You said one note." A few people laughed under their breath, unsure whether they admired his courage or thought he was foolish. The host stood slowly and walked toward the piano, motioning for the man to follow. "Then come forward," he said. "Let's see if you can do what no one else here dared to." The room went silent again. Even the sound of the storm outside seemed to fade as the man began to walk. His shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. Every step felt heavier than it should, as if the air itself was watching him. As he reached the center of the hall, the piano seemed even larger up close. Its surface gleamed like a dark lake under the chandelier's light. He paused for a moment, his reflection looking back at him from the lid. The host stood beside him, arms crossed, that same smug smile on his face. "You know," he said quietly, "many people here think this piano is cursed, still want to touch it." The man looked at him calmly. "It's just wood and strings," he said. "The only thing that gives it power is fear." The host raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He took a step back, giving the man space. All eyes were on him now. The room was so quiet that you could hear the soft crackle of the fire across the hall. The man took a slow breath. He didn't rush. He ran his fingers lightly across the edge of the keys, feeling the smooth coolness beneath them. Dust clung faintly to the surface. No one had played it in years. Someone whispered from the corner, "Do you think it'll make a sound?" Another voice replied softly, "I don't know. Maybe it's better if it doesn't." The man lifted his hand. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of so many eyes watching. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The chandelier light shimmered above him. The storm outside pressed against the windows, and the faint scent of old wood and wax filled the air. Then, with a gentle motion, he pressed a single key. The note rang out, clear and pure. It was soft, almost fragile, yet it carried through the entire hall. The sound echoed off the walls, rich and haunting. For a second, no one breathed. The piano's voice filled the silence that had been waiting all night to be broken. The man didn't move. He kept his hand resting on the key as the sound faded slowly into nothing. Then he lifted his finger and stepped back. No lights flickered. No ghostly wind swept through the hall. Nothing terrible happened. Just one simple, beautiful sound and silence afterward. The crowd stood frozen. They didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They just stared, as if unsure what they had just witnessed. The host blinked, his smirk fading slightly. "Well," he said finally, forcing a laugh, "it seems the curse is broken after all." But his voice didn't sound as confident as before. There was something in the man's calmness that unsettled him. The man looked at the piano once more, then turned toward the crowd. His voice was gentle but steady. "Fear is strange," he said quietly. "It grows when we feed it, even when there's nothing real behind it. Sometimes all it takes to end it is one small act." A few people lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others simply looked thoughtful. The host cleared his throat, trying to regain his control over the room. "Well," he said again, "a promise is a promise." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. $1,000, as agreed. He held it out, but the man didn't take it. "I didn't play for money," he said softly. "You can keep it." The host's smile faltered completely now. He stood there awkwardly, the envelope still in his hand, as the man turned away and walked toward the back of the hall. The guests began to whisper again, but their tone had changed. There was no laughter this time, no mocking smiles. It was as if they were all seeing something new. Not the piano, not the money, but themselves. The man reached the large doors at the end of the hall and paused. He looked back once, his eyes falling on the piano. Under the chandelier's light, it looked softer now, no longer haunting, just quiet, at peace. He gave a small nod and stepped outside. The cold night air rushed in as the doors closed behind him. Inside, the hall remained silent for a long moment. Then someone spoke softly. It was only a note, but it sounded different. Another replied, maybe because it wasn't played for fear or pride. It was just honest. The host sat down slowly, his expression unreadable. For the first time that night, he didn't know what to say. The piano that had once been a prop in his little game had turned into something else, something that had humbled him. The sound of that single note still lingered in the air, as if it had left behind a small trace of truth no one could ignore. The guests began to leave soon after. The laughter didn't return. They spoke quietly, almost respectfully, as though they had just come from something sacred. When the last guest left, the host was alone in the hall. The fire had burned low, casting faint shadows across the room. He stared at the piano for a long time, his reflection glimmering faintly on its surface. He finally walked over and sat down on the same bench the man had used. His fingers hovered above the keys. For the first time, he wondered what it might feel like to play without fear. Not to impress, not to control, but simply to create a sound. But he didn't press a key. He sat there quietly, listening to the echo of the note that had already been played, one simple sound that had changed the entire night. Outside, the rain began to ease, and a faint light crept over the horizon. The night of the challenge was over, but the lesson it left behind had only just begun. The night after the challenge felt different inside the mansion. The walls that once echoed with laughter and shallow conversation now carried a strange quiet. Even the servants who cleaned the hall the next morning noticed it. They moved slowly, speaking in low voices, as if afraid of disturbing something that was still present in the air. The piano stood where it always had, gleaming softly in the morning light. The chandelier above it sparkled, but the mood was not the same. The house itself seemed to remember the sound of that one note. It had been so simple, just a single tone, but it felt like it had left a mark on everyone who had heard it. The host sat alone in the same chair near the fireplace. His drink sat untouched beside him, and for once, there was no smug smile on his face. His thoughts replayed the moment again and again. The man stepping forward, the quiet bravery, the calm voice saying, "I didn't play for money." Those words had settled deep inside him, refusing to leave. He had expected to feel triumph when someone finally accepted his challenge. He thought it would be a moment of control, a way to prove that people would do anything for money. But what happened had been the complete opposite. The man who played hadn't been desperate or greedy. He had been peaceful, almost gentle. And that one action had made the host question everything about himself. Outside, the morning sun rose over the garden, melting the last traces of last night's rain. Birds sang softly, their songs floating through the open windows. The sound felt pure, natural, effortless, just like that single note had been. Later that day, a few of the guests returned to collect forgotten items. A coat, a bracelet, a phone charger. They greeted the host politely, but their voices carried a new tone. They no longer spoke to him with the same admiration or flattery. There was respect, but it was distant, cautious. They talked more about the man who had played the note than about the host himself. "He didn't even take the money," one of them said quietly. "Can you believe that? In a world where people fight for $1, he walked away from 1,000. Another replied, "Maybe he knew something we didn't. Maybe it was never about the piano." The host overheard them but said nothing. He realized that even though it was his house, his piano, and his challenge, the story no longer belonged to him. It belonged to that man, and to the truth he had left behind. That evening, the host stood before the piano again. The room was empty, the lights dim. He placed his hand on the lid, feeling the smooth, cool surface beneath his palm. He remembered how proud he had felt when he first bought it, how it had been a symbol of success, of wealth, of power. But now, as he stood there alone, it just looked like an ordinary instrument. Beautiful, yes, but ordinary. He thought of the people who had once admired him, who had come to his parties just to be seen near him. None of them had ever really cared about him. They had cared about what he represented. Money, status, influence. But that man, the one who played the note, had cared about none of it. And yet, in a single moment, he had done something no one else in that room could. He had broken the illusion that money could buy courage, respect, or peace. The host sat down on the piano bench. His reflection stared back at him from the black surface. He hesitated, fingers hovering above the keys. The thought of pressing one made his heart race, not because of fear, but because he finally understood what that note meant. It wasn't just a sound. It was a choice. A choice to act when everyone else hesitated. A choice to face something unknown without needing anything in return. A choice to be human in a world obsessed with pride. He pressed a key softly, almost afraid of breaking the quiet. The note was gentle, delicate. It filled the room for just a second, then disappeared. But the feeling it brought was unexpected. He felt lighter. The sound wasn't just echoing in the hall. It was echoing inside him. He played another key, then another. Simple notes, nothing more. He didn't know any songs, didn't care if it sounded right. He just played because it felt honest. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't performing for anyone. He was simply being. A servant passed by the doorway and stopped, watching quietly. The host didn't notice. His hands moved slowly, uncertain but sincere. The melody wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. Each sound carried a part of him that had been silent for years. When he finally stopped, he sat there for a long time, staring at the piano. The last note still rang faintly in his mind, as if refusing to fade completely. He realized that all his life, he had been chasing noise, attention, applause, admiration. But in that one night, in that one sound, he had discovered the power of silence. That night's event spread beyond the mansion. People in the city began to talk about it. It wasn't just gossip. It was a story that grew with each telling. A man offered $1,000 for one note, they said, and someone played it not for money, but to prove a point. Some people said the story wasn't true, that it had been exaggerated. Others said they knew someone who had been there. But no matter how it was told, the message stayed the same. Courage doesn't come from wealth or power. It comes from truth. The host tried to go about his usual life, attending meetings, throwing parties, smiling at cameras. But something inside him had changed. The laughter of his guests sounded hollow now. The clinking of glasses, once pleasant, now felt meaningless. He couldn't unhear that note. It followed him everywhere. Weeks passed. One evening, while walking through the city, he saw a small group gathered around a street musician playing a battered old guitar. The man wasn't famous, his clothes were worn, and the guitar had scratches all over it. But his music drew people in. The sound was raw, filled with emotion. The host stood at the edge of the crowd, listening. No one there cared who the musician was. They just listened. And in that moment, the host realized something that nearly made him smile for the first time in days. That same feeling was in the air, the same peace that had filled his mansion after that single note. When the musician finished, people dropped a few coins into the open guitar case. The host reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his wallet, and hesitated. Then he put it away. Instead, he clapped just once but sincerely. The musician looked up, nodded, and smiled back. That small exchange meant more than money ever could. Later, the host returned home. He didn't go to his study or his wine cellar. He went straight to the piano. It was late, and the only light came from the moon shining through the tall windows. The air was cool and still. He sat down again, pressing one key, then another. The sound filled the empty hall softly, blending with the night breeze. Each note seemed to wash something away. His arrogance, his loneliness, his doubt. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." He wasn't sure who he was thanking, the man, the piano, or the moment that had opened his eyes. But the words came naturally. The music continued quietly, no audience, no challenge, no prize. Just sound. Just honesty. In that silence, he finally understood what had shocked everyone that night. It wasn't the act of playing a note. It was the courage to do something simple, sincere, and real in a world built on pretense. That single sound had changed everything. Not just for him, but for everyone who had heard it. And though the house was once again quiet, it was no longer haunted by fear or pride. It was filled with something new. Something that could not be bought, measured, or faked. Peace. Time has a way of softening memories, but some moments never fade. The night of the challenge inside that grand mansion became one of those moments that people spoke of for years afterward. It wasn't just because of the money, or the strange offer, or even the piano itself. It was because of what that one act revealed about people. Their pride, their fear, their courage, and their heart. Months passed, and the mansion slowly grew quieter. The big gatherings that had once filled it became less frequent. The host still lived there, but he had changed. He no longer spent his nights surrounded by people trying to impress him or flatter him. He had grown tired of shallow laughter and empty praise. Instead, he began inviting only a few people, artists, travelers, and ordinary folks with stories to tell. The sound of fake applause had been replaced by the sound of real conversation. For the first time, his house felt alive, not because of noise, but because of meaning. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the tall windows, he found himself dusting the old piano. It had been weeks since he last played. His hands moved slowly across the lid, tracing the smooth lines of the instrument that had once been a symbol of pride and arrogance. He smiled faintly, remembering that moment when the quiet man had pressed a single key, creating a sound that had echoed through everyone's hearts. It still amazed him how something so small could change so much. He sat down and pressed a note again, soft, simple. The sound drifted through the air. This time, though, it carried warmth. No challenge. No pride. Just peace. The piano had once been an object he used to test others. Now it had become his teacher. In the weeks that followed, he began spending more time with people who lived outside his usual circle. He visited small music shops, old cafes, and street corners where musicians played for whoever cared to listen. Sometimes he'd sit quietly at the back, blending into the crowd. Other times, he'd strike up conversations with strangers, asking about their lives. He found that people had stories far richer than he had ever imagined. They didn't need wealth to be interesting. They didn't need fame to be wise. They simply needed someone to listen. And he listened. One evening, while walking through a quiet park, he came across a little girl sitting on a bench with a tiny keyboard on her lap. She was pressing random keys, humming to herself. Her shoes were worn, and her clothes looked old, but her smile was bright. He stopped for a moment, watching. She noticed him and said cheerfully, "It's not a real piano, but I like pretending it is." He smiled back. "You play beautifully," he said. She giggled. "I don't know how to play. I just make sounds that make me happy." Her answer caught him off guard. Simple, honest, and full of truth. Just like that single note from the night that had changed everything. He sat down beside her. "Do you want to learn?" he asked. She looked at him curiously. "You can teach. Maybe not in the way you think," he replied with a gentle smile. "But I can show you what I've learned." He placed his fingers gently on the small keyboard, pressing one note at a time, letting the sound linger before moving to the next. She watched, eyes wide with fascination. "That's not a song," she said after a moment. "No," he said softly. "But sometimes one note is enough." The girl didn't understand right away, but she smiled anyway and copied him. Together, they played simple sounds, not caring about rhythm or melody. Just sound. Just life. When he finally stood to leave, she thanked him and waved. He walked away slowly, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. A quiet sense of purpose. That night, as he sat by his window, he looked out over the city lights. It was strange how he used to think power came from having more money, more possessions, more attention. But now he saw that real power came from giving, from sharing, from connecting. He realized that night in the mansion had not just been a test for others. It had been a mirror held up to himself. The challenge he had given was really his own. The man who played the note hadn't done it to prove anything to him. He had done it to remind everyone what really mattered. The lesson was simple. Courage is not loud. It is quiet, calm, and kind. Over the next few years, people began noticing a change in him. He was no longer the arrogant man who flaunted his fortune. He became known for his humility, his generosity, and his listening ear. He sponsored local artists, funded free music classes for children, and often sat in the back of community performances without introducing himself. He didn't want credit. He just wanted to see others find joy in what he had once taken for granted. Sometimes, after everyone left, he'd return home, sit at the piano, and play one note. Always the same one. It became his quiet ritual, a reminder of where it all began. Years later, when he grew old and his hair turned gray, the mansion remained, though it looked softer now. The golden chandeliers still hung above, but their light felt warmer, gentler. The halls that once echoed with meaningless noise now carried laughter, music, and kindness. People would visit often, not for his wealth but for his wisdom. And whenever someone asked about the piano, he would tell them the story. Not in a grand or dramatic way, but simply, as if passing along a small secret. He would say, "There was once a man who offered $1,000 to anyone brave enough to play a single note on that piano. Everyone hesitated except one man. He played it not for money, but because he believed sound should be free. And that note changed everything." Some guests thought it was just a story, something poetic. Others believed it deeply, leaving the mansion inspired. But no matter how people took it, the story continued to live, passed from person to person, city to city. And every time it was told, it reminded someone somewhere to act with honesty, to do things not for reward, but for truth. One morning, as the old man sat alone by the window with a cup of tea, he heard faint music drifting from the garden. A few children from the nearby village had been invited to explore the grounds. They were playing an old tune on a small speaker, singing and laughing. He listened quietly, a smile touching his lips. He didn't need to go out and see them. The sound was enough. He looked over at the piano one last time. The sunlight fell across the keys, turning them golden. He stood slowly, walked over and sat down. His fingers trembled slightly as he pressed one key. The sound filled the room softly, clear, gentle, full of life. And then he whispered, "That's enough." It was his final note. After that day, people who came to the mansion noticed something. The piano was always open, but no one ever played it again. Not out of fear, but out of respect. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a symbol of truth, of courage, of what it means to be human. Years later, the mansion became a community art home. The new owners kept everything, the furniture, the paintings, and most importantly, the piano. They hung a small plaque beside it that read, "He offered $1,000 for a single note, but what he received was worth far more." Visitors often paused to read those words, wondering about the story behind them. Some would sit nearby, lost in thought. Others would smile as if they already knew. The lesson lived on, not through fame or fortune, but through small, quiet moments that touched people's hearts. Somewhere, in every generation, there would always be someone who remembered the story. Someone who knew that courage doesn't always roar. It can be as simple as pressing one key, taking one step, or speaking one truth when everyone else stays silent. And though the world outside kept changing, the meaning of that single note never did. It was a reminder that even the smallest act of sincerity could echo through time, long after the sound itself had faded. Because sometimes, one note really can change everything.